Right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first and maybe the only episode of what I like to call Mental Musings. That's a working title. But basically, what I want to do is I want to talk about my experiences working in the mental health sector in the UK, some of the problems I've faced, some of the problems the sector faces, and how I've dealt with the problems that I've faced. To give you a little bit of background on myself, I've been working in the sector for about 5 years. I've spent 4 years working in one of the biggest mental health hospitals in the country, and sort of 1 year outside of that role doing other things, like working as a teaching assistant in schools for learning disorders and ASD. And I think I've got quite a broad sense of experience alongside a degree I've done in psychology and counselling. And I think that's given me a lot of insight into how to provide care in a setting like this. And I hope today that I can raise a bit of awareness about what it's like receiving care in a mental health hospital. And perhaps if someone out there is working in a mental health hospital, then I could provide you some insight for how to better inform your care. Or maybe you're just watching this out of curiosity, or maybe you have relatives who have mental health conditions. Either way, I hope to kind of inform you and give you a few tools to deal with anything you might run into. But anyway, let's get into it. So I think what I'd like to kind of draw attention to in this video is the importance of understanding the conditions you're working with. And every condition is different, from personality disorder to borderline personality disorder to bipolar disorder to depression. They're all different. They all present their own complex needs, their challenges, and it's important to understand them. And I chose dementia to talk about today because I think a lot of people have a passing understanding of dementia. They'll probably think of a degenerative brain disorder that results in confusion, forgetfulness, disorientation. And that's definitely those are all very important things to understand. But there's a lot more to unpack under the surface that is very important to thinking about when you inform your care for someone with dementia. Because you have to think about how someone with dementia processes the world around them. Because it's very different to how you or I process the world around them, where you can listen to me speaking, and to at least some degree, sometimes it makes perfect sense. And you can kind of take in what I'm saying and process it and disseminate it into information. Whereas someone with dementia might find that very difficult. Despite being perceptive, I've noticed that almost every dementia patient I've worked with is extremely perceptive. You're also going to have to forgive any noises you hear from my dog in the background. I can't control that. But anyway, moving on. I'd like to talk about how a patient I've worked with dementia, and how I manage their behaviours and how other people manage their behaviours in a way that I don't think is quite as effective. And I want to empathise with both approaches and understand why they did what they did, and understand why I did what I did, and why I think one approach is better. So I think when I look at some of the other behaviours that occur with dementia, you have behaviours that are sensory behaviours, you have wandering behaviours, and these are mostly behaviours that are used to manage their sort of stress and anxiety. Because if you imagine this person's life where the world is kind of like a blur around them, and they don't necessarily understand everything that's going on around them. So you probably feel quite anxious and lost most of the time. And these sensory behaviours and wandering behaviours are ways they cope with that a lot of the time. For those of you who are neurodivergent or exist in neurodivergent spaces, you're probably familiar with the concept of stimming, where these behaviours are quite like that, where it's sort of you feel overwhelmed and you're taking in sensations to kind of deal with that. Only with dementia, particularly the sensory behaviours, it's often more about sort of rekindling memories and capturing the positive feelings behind them. If you've ever been to a dementia ward or you've worked around dementia people, you might be familiar with the concept of a sensory board. They use this for learning disorder as well. It's not something specific to dementia, but it'll often just be something that's spread out on the wall, and it's just covered with all sorts of knickknacks. You can have keys, blocks of wood, pieces of paper, cloth, and the idea is they can just reach out and touch it, and they will sort of achieve some enrichment from that. You know, maybe someone is a carpenter and he could run his fingers over a rough piece of wood and it would take him back to that feeling of being a carpenter. Because a lot of the time in even late stage of dementia, those kind of long-term memories remain somewhat intact, which is why a lot of the time you can kind of conjure things up. I used to talk used to talk with this patient about his career as a roofer before he became mostly mute, and I imagine he might still remember his career even after he was mute, but that's speculation. But I'd like to talk about some examples of those sensory behaviours and how other staff and myself responded to them and managed them. So moving on. One of the sensory behaviours I had to deal with a lot was just being touched by that patient. And this came about because we had to manage his wandering behaviours mostly. So during meal times, getting him to sit down to eat his dinner was a Herculean task, but I think we had quite an eloquent solution in managing it, where we would have 2 members of staff and we would just sit beside him on a bench. And I think that was very effective because not only did it stop him from wandering and encourage him to actually eat, it also meant that he had support he needed. We were there, we could stop him choking, we could manage his mouthfuls, because overstuffing one's mouth is a very common thing when it comes to degenerative brain disorders, where there's a loss of sensation in their mouth, where they don't understand how much is in their mouth. But that's beside the point. So we managed it that way by staying close to him. But this kind of created a situation where his sensory behaviours manifested in a way where he wanted to touch us, which isn't really a problem, I think. But I think understandably a lot of people were uncomfortable with this. Because a lot of the times he would, touch you on the hips, touch your waist, squeeze your thigh. And I think this is where it's important to start to work your way into the mindset of someone who has dementia. Because I think in a setting where a lot of the time you're managing risk and you're mindful of someone's previous history and prior risks, it's very easy to fall into a trap of assuming intent behind that touch. And a lot of people I worked with assumed that touch was inappropriate or it was sexually charged. And the response in that situation, when you have, an inappropriate touch, is to often to prompt, it's to say, don't touch me that way, that's inappropriate. And you redirect the hand. And I empathize with that response because where you're minimizing the risk to yourself and others, if you're allowing yourself to be touched inappropriately, you're creating problems for that patient because you're allowing him to behave in challenging ways. And of course, you're making yourself vulnerable because if you're touched inappropriately, that's sexual assault. I don't need to explain that to anyone. But I think this is where it's important to take the wider context of the condition that you're dealing with. So if you take a moment to sort of slip into his mindset where he's in a dining room, there's other people around, people he probably doesn't recognize, he's confused, he doesn't know where he is, he probably feels quite anxious, very realistically speaking. I think everyone with dementia is probably anxious all the time. So if you think about where he would put his hand on your thigh and squeeze it, I imagine it's much like the behavior of a child squeezing a stuffed toy in bed, where that provides them a sense of comfort. It provides them some kind of feedback that they can ground themselves in. And I think the response to that behavior, if we kind of use that to provide our care, is very different to if we assume sexual intent in that touch. The way I used to deal with it personally was I would actually just hold his hand. And I think instantly what you've done there is you've kind of discharged the sexual element of the behavior, where holding someone's hand is much more appropriate, I'd argue, or you can put your hand on top of theirs. But what you've done there is you've made the touch more appropriate, and you've also still given him that feedback. And you can even provide more feedback yourself by kind of squeezing his hand. And you provide that sense of comfort that he wants to get from squeezing your thigh. So I think that's one example of how I've managed behavior like that. And hopefully if you find yourself in that situation, you take a moment to think about the intent behind the behavior and measure your response towards it, because I think measuring your response is very important. And I'd like to talk about one more example and talk about what I like to call the prompt mindset. So the prompt mindset, I think, is very popular or very common in a workplace like mine. I work in a secure setting, so people mostly have forensic backgrounds and they have quite a high level of risk to themselves or other people. And the prompt mindset is, you kind of think of it this way. You see a behavior you don't recognize, and you immediately assume there's risk behind that behavior, or that behavior has the potential to become risky. And so then your instinct is to shut it down. So you say, don't do that or leave that alone. And the example I'd like to call upon was the same patient who had dementia, and he was on a 2-to-1. And for anyone who doesn't know what that means, that just means there's 2 members of staff present at all times around him, just to offer that support he might need with, changing clothes, eating, laundry, falls, if he's prone to that, all sorts of things. Could even be safeguarding him from other patients, which was a very valid concern because you have this guy who likes to touch everyone. People don't like that. Anyway, so what we had in this situation was we were sitting with the patient. He was pacing because he has dementia. A lot of them pace. And he went to pick up a chair. He just grabbed the arm of the chair and began to pull it towards him. And the member of staff who was with me, I didn't react to this behaviour because I kind of independently assessed the risk as low. Because he's elderly, he was only moving it with one hand, and he was just kind of dragging it across the floor. But the member of staff I was with kind of quite firmly said, leave the chair alone, don't touch that. And I want to empathise with that response because I understand where it came from, where he was managing the risk, and I've been there. I think sometimes when you see someone pick up a chair, your first thought is, who's he going to hit with it, And that's unfortunately common. But anyway, I do think his response in that instance was not measured very well, because if you raise your voice to someone like that, that could be distressing to someone with dementia who doesn't necessarily understand why you're raising your voice at them. And I think this is one again where you want to try and get into his head and understand why he's doing what he's doing. So when I see that behaviour, I think it could be a sensory thing. Again, he could want to feel the weight of the chair. He could want to hear the sound it makes being dragged across the floor. Could be all sorts of things. He could genuinely want to move it to a better position. He could genuinely want to sit in it, but not sort of understand that thought in his head, because again, processing information and processing desires particularly can be quite difficult, which is why a lot of dementia people are incontinent, because they can't really process the desire or need to go to the toilet. So I think the way I would deal with a situation like that is, I think it's important to ask a question. Because if you ask a question like, are you alright? Do you need help with the chair? Would you like to sit down? You instantly you get them to introspect. And they might say, yes, I need the chair to be moved. I want to sit here. Or they might say, I'm just feeling. They might say nothing. But inside their head, they're probably processing what you've said to them to some degree. And they might realise they're not really doing anything with the chair and move on. In which case, you've diffused the non-risk of the situation. And I think that's again where I'd like to hammer home the importance of empathy. I think when people think of empathy, they tend to think of, someone venting to you and you saying, I understand how you feel. And that's a very important core aspect of empathy. And it is empathy in arguably its truest sense. But I think a different kind of empathy is understanding someone's angle, so to speak, where you kind of try and assess how they're thinking, you kind of guess how they're thinking, and you probably do that when you're listening to someone vent, because you're understanding, why they feel sad or why they feel upset, and then you can empathize with them. And I think this is why it's important to empathize with your patients in that way, because you can inform your care for them and inform your response to them, and then you provide a safer environment where they feel comfortable to behave in ways they want, to express themselves. And I think too often you see people who don't have enough patience to do that, and they get stuck in this prompt mindset where sometimes they even, get angry. And that's a big pet peeve of mine, where you have someone who is doing a pretty innocent behavior, like people with dementia. They don't really have any concept of personal space. They will just walk straight past you. They'll brush your legs, and people get frustrated at that, and they prompt and they say, oh, don't come that close to me. And realistically, you're in a situation where you're not managing the behavior, you're not improving the behavior, you're just distressing this guy for no reason, because he doesn't understand what he's doing wrong. And I think that's why it's so important to, whenever you're in a situation like this, you need to understand the condition you're dealing with and understand why the behaviors you're dealing with are manifesting. You need to take a moment for each behavior to try and assess the reasoning behind it and assess the risk. Sometimes you don't have a chance to do that. Sometimes you do have to act, but that's a topic for another video. And you want to treat everything differently because every patient is different. I think even if you take something like dementia, maybe only 3 in 5 people, last time I checked, would experience a wandering type behavior, for example. And, I think it's just so important to make sure you understand what you're dealing with and be dynamic in the way you provide care. So I think if you take anything home from this video, be mindful of being empathetic. Be mindful of the conditions you're working with. It's amazing how much 10 minutes on Google can teach you about a condition compared to the one time your friend was talking about their grandfather with dementia. You'd be seriously surprised how much you can learn. And I think just even taking the time to do that, to be empathetic and to learn a little bit about what you're dealing with, can really go a long, long way in informing your care and making someone feel safe and looked after. Someone who really doesn't have a lot in the world left for them. And I think that's very, 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 very important. But anyway, I think that mostly covers what I wanted to say in the video. This is completely unscripted. I've been reading prompts over there. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, or at least found it a little bit informative. I might do more of these. Yeah, thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something.